Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
How much should you be paying an associate doctor, associate dentist? I get this question a lot from MGE clients. And whether you're looking at getting an associate now, or maybe you have one, or you're looking at one in the future, this is something that you should be thinking about. Because let's face it, compensation is a deal breaker. And that's what we're going to talk about in this week's episode of Dental Business RX. My name is Jeff Blumberg, and I'm your host. And before I get into the compensation point, I do want to just point up a couple things, because obviously there's a number of other considerations when you're bringing on an associate beyond how you compensate them. I'm not going to really get into those in this episode. I mean, some of the things we'd be talking about would be clinical excellence. Obviously, that's extremely important. Maybe their speed, how quickly they move, and get through procedures, their philosophy, whether a partnership is in the cards, what their long-term career plans are. Are they planning on being in your office long-term or moving or opening their own practice? And of course, whether your practice can actually support an associate or not. Those are obviously important subjects. If I were to add those to this podcast, this would be a 7-hour, I guess at that point it qualifies as an audiobook. So I'm going to stick with the compensation issue in this podcast, because that'll keep us in a manageable level. Hopefully I'll standard that 30 minutes or less point that we talk about at the intro. And look, if you have questions about any of those things beyond compensation, you can always email me. I'd be happy to answer at jeffb@mgeonline.com. If I get enough feedback on it, maybe we'll make it the subject of another podcast. So how should you pay your associate? Well, the short answer is a lot of that depends on how you plan to utilize that associate. Now, what I'm going to do, there's a number of different possibilities, obviously, but generally how you utilize an associate breaks down to 3 simple categories for the most part. There are obviously other possibilities, but there are 3 basic categories. Those categories are the traditional associate model, the production doctor associate model, and what we call the autonomous operation model. That's the Terminator model, I guess. The autonomous operation model. That's basically, for instance, if you have an associate in a second location. Now, each of these models would be compensated differently. And I should warn you as you're listening to this, I am going to go over some numbers. This might translate better visually, but I wanted to do it as a podcast, so I'm just going for it. And as we go through it, you'll see that I'm explaining as I cover each of the different models and how you should pay somebody. I'm going to go over general compensation percentages that they would work under. Now, for example, let's say I say in the traditional model, you should compensate somebody 30% of collections. That 30% might be a combination of a percentage plan or an override if they hit certain levels of production, plus a base. It really depends. And I'm going to talk about that towards the end of the podcast. But what I plan to do is cover each of these models I just mentioned, the 3 models, how you would compensate the associate there. And then at the end, we'll kind of wrap all of this up and tie it together. So let's start with the traditional associate model. What is it and how would you pay an associate in this setup? What is the traditional associate model? It's what it sounds like. This is the model we've seen for the last 30, 40 years. This is you're practicing and you bring in a doctor to pick up the procedures that you just don't want to do anymore. Maybe you don't want to do molar endo. Maybe you don't want to see kids. Maybe you don't want to do emergencies. You don't want to be on call. You don't want to work on Saturdays. Maybe you let them see new patients. Maybe you expect them to bring in their own. Maybe you let them do recalls, exams. Maybe you don't, right? The traditional model, what we've always seen. This might be a doctor who has experience. This might be a doctor who's just out of school and is looking for a mentorship type situation with this setup. How you would compensate somebody in this model usually would be about 30% of collectible production or 30 to 35% of collections. Now, again, that might be a blend of a base and other percentage incentives, which I'll be talking about towards the end of the podcast. But the safe bet is 30% of production, meaning collectible production. In other words, it's not adjusted production. You're not writing anything off. Or 30 to 35% of collections. Usually there's a split with lab fees. If I weren't splitting lab fees, I'd most likely stick with the lower end, 30% of collections. Right? And again, I should add this as I go through. I'm a bigger fan of connecting collections to a pay plan because that's actual money you've received. When you're trying to use production as a benchmark, it gets a little tough because you don't know if you're going to get paid for it unless you've been prepaid. So collections is always a safe bet. But that's the general compensation level there. So with that, let's move on to model number 2. This is the production doctor model. Now, this is something you may never have heard of before, and it's a bit of a newer development. We've seen quite a few MGE clients do it, really beginning to gain ground in the mid-2000s, maybe especially from 2005 forward. And here's basically what this is. You have a practice where the owner doctor, who's usually the best at interfacing with patients, presents and closes, or sells, for lack of a better word, treatment, and has associates perform more or less all of the procedures. So get this concept for a second. If you're an owner doctor, this would mean you're presenting treatment plans, the patient accepts it and they pay, and then you have an associate do or deliver the entire treatment plan. Now, that setup might be a little bit of a hybrid too. You might have the owner doctor sell treatment plans and they keep certain type of procedures for themselves. Maybe they place implants still, or they do high-end cosmetic cases. You know, they do veneers and things like this. But for the most part, the majority of the practice's production is done by associate doctors. Okay, so all diagnosis and treatment plan flows through the owner, and the majority of the office's production is done by associates. Now, it may sound intriguing to you. This may be something that you've never heard of or considered before. There's a few things I'd want to explain to you about it, because obviously there are certain cases where you absolutely don't want to do this. It would be a disaster. And there are certain cases where it could be a very workable solution. So a few things have to be in place to make this type of a setup work. Number one, the office has to have the patient volume to justify this setup, which truthfully, you need to have the patient volume to justify getting an associate at all. But in this case, you need to have adequate patient volume. Minimally, what I'd be looking at here is the office would have to have at least 2 full-time hygienists, probably about 50 or more new patients a month, 50. And otherwise, there's not enough going on to keep the owner doctor and the production doctors busy. The associates in this type of a setup have to have great clinical skills. And obviously every associate should, okay? But this person should be a doctor who has some experience. You don't want somebody who, is just learning or just getting going in the profession unless they happen to be again, I'm not writing a new grad here. I'm just saying that generally, if I have somebody who's out of school 7-8 years and they're very familiar with working in a moderate to high volume environment, they're going to move faster than somebody who's just passed their boards. All right. We want somebody who's got some experience. And obviously it goes without saying you're going to want somebody who does excellent clinical, because now this person is basically doing all the work in your practice. And obviously, if you're not doing the clinical yourself in this model, you're going to want to look at it. You're going to want to see it to make sure that it's not starting to go south. You're also going to need a well-structured organization. Because the more productive the practice gets, the bigger deal weak points in the office become. You're going to want a well-trained and skilled office manager. You're going to want sharp treatment coordinators, which that's the type of thing that MGE clients pick up when they go through the MGE Power program. Now, considering that you have this in place, there's one last point that I want you to just show you as far as how did this model work. So I want you to imagine that you're very good at case acceptance and you're very good at, or rather case presentation and getting acceptance. If you are an owner doctor and you're primarily just presenting treatment plans, think about it for a second how long it takes you to present a larger case. Let's say it's, 7 crowns and 3 root canals, all right? How long would it take you to present that case to a patient and get them to accept that case and work out financial arrangements with your treatment coordinator? Let's just look at doctor time for a second. For the doctor owner, that might be 20 to 40 minutes, right? Maybe an hour at most if the person has a lot of questions. All right. And that's, what I just described is anywhere from a $10,000 to $15,000 case, maybe more depending on your fee structure. Well, how long would it take you to perform that case clinically? Obviously, that depends on the doctor doing it, but really that would take hours and hours and hours. So assuming patient volume is adequate, like let's say you're getting 6-8 new patients a day and you're also doing that plus seeing recall patients, you could in theory keep 2 to 3 doctors busy producing. One doctor presenting treatment, 20 to 40 minute treatment presentation for hours of actual clinical work, you could keep 2 to 3 doctors busy. So it's intriguing, and it's intriguing in that sense alone. Now, a couple things to think with when you're developing a compensation package for this is you're not doing any of the production or very little of the production yourself anymore in this setup. So the traditional pay plan of 30 to 35% would not work. It would actually it wouldn't work. There's not enough profitability in the practice to support you at that point if you're paying associates that much. But then from the associate's perspective, it's kind of a bit of a dream job. Think about it. You just sold that case for your associate of 7 crowns and 4 root canals, and this associate gets to walk in, do high-end dentistry, put their gloves on, and go to work. They didn't have to do anything. They just went to work. So it's not the same setup if they're having to come in on Saturdays, do on-call, sell the case themselves, etc. It's a lot less work for them in that regard, and it's a bit of a dream job in that they're coming in and doing high-end procedures. So with all of this in mind, for the production doctor model, the associate makes 20 to 25% of collections max. The associate wouldn't pay for labs in this case. Now, you probably just heard that, 20 to 25%, you think no one is going to work for that. All right, well, let me give you a scenario. And I guarantee you, I've seen this happen with our clients. They'll present this to a prospective associate and they'll say, what? Well, this office down the street was going to pay me 30-something%. Well, if you do the math with the associate, they start to see the validity of this model. So they just came from an office where they were offered a good base salary and a 30% override when they hit certain production targets, right? That office offered them a traditional associate setup, which had been producing maybe $30,000 to $35,000 a month. They'd have to present and diagnose, throw in treatment, et cetera. So that's what they're walking in with. They're walking in with this 30 to 35% number, and here you are saying 20 to 25%. All right. Well, point out to them, look, in that model, you're doing $35,000 a month, and you're getting paid 35% or 30%, which is $10,500. All right. And in this case, you're doing whatever it is that they want you to do. Here, you're expecting them to produce a lot more because you're giving them treatment that would have been on your schedule. You're expecting them to produce $60,000 to $100,000 a month. 20% of that is $12,000 to $20,000. And as an added bonus, they're getting to do all these cool procedures. So once you lay that out for somebody, they start to see like, oh, this is kind of cool. This sort of works. Maybe I could do this. So we've had a lot of clients do this. It's worked out really well. As I said, one of the key points you have to maintain, you have to maintain it, is you have to keep an eye on the clinical. If you're not doing it all, you're going to have to look at lab cases. You may even go and look at some preps with patients. You pop in as the nice owner doc. Hey, I see you met Dr. Smith. Wow, look at that work he did. Wow, he's great. Look, it's amazing. So you can pick up anything before it becomes a problem. Again, if there's an associate who has a real problem with you walking in and talking to your patients and looking at their work, that's a problem. I wouldn't go with that. And obviously in this case, because you're selling the treatment you're expecting them to do, there has to be a basic agreement clinically. They have to be on the same page with you clinically. As a matter of fact, what I'd recommend, you might want to do this with all of your associates, and it may not be that valid with a newer doctor, but if you wanted to see if a doctor's on the same page with you, you can talk to them, obviously, but what you might want to do is take some of your charts or some x-rays and some of the charting you've done. Don't show them your treatment plan and have them treatment plan the case. So, you have, here's some patient records. You got x-rays, you got your charting, etc. And you go, good, how would you treatment plan that case? And you see, does it match up to how you would treatment plan? Because there is a degree of subjectivity in dentistry, and what you don't want is you don't want to have treatment planned X procedure. That's what you've treatment planned. That's what the patient has agreed to. And then your associate walks in and they're telling them something else. That just looks bad organizationally. So this is important. And some last words on this. As with all associate models, even when you do it correctly, your percentage of profit, if you're just going from being a solo practitioner, is going to drop. But the amount of profit you're making and freedom that you have should go up. So let's say you're a solo doctor and you're at 45% profit and you're collecting $90,000 a month. And I pick some random numbers. If you're driving in a car, maybe you're doing this math in your head. I have it all written down, so I got a cheat sheet here. But okay, solo practitioner, you got a 55% overhead. You're netting 45%. You're doing $90 a month. All right, so you're making $36,000 a month in profit, or $32,000 a year. Now let's say you build up to a multi-provider practice doing $400 a month at 25% profit. Okay, so the percentage of profit is lower. True, but you're making 100 a month or 1.2 million a year. You also have more freedom. If you want to take a week or two off, it's not like the world ends at that point and the practice goes to zero. So you're getting a smaller piece of a bigger pie, essentially. Last comment I'll make on this is with the production doctor model. If you do it right, it can be a dream. You do it wrong, it can be a real mess. Inadequate volume, an associate is a bad fit, can cost you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. I've seen it. So if you have any doubts about this, one of the things I would mention, and I'll mention this at the end of the podcast as well, at MGE, we provide a free consultation for you. You can call us at 800-640-1140 or visit us at mgeonline.com and request one. We're more than happy to talk to you about this. Which brings us to our last model, the autonomous operation, working in your second location. I love that, autonomous operation. So let's have a look at this. So with autonomous, we're meaning more or less that this doctor is working on their own. They are you, essentially, when you're not there. The only thing that's missing is ownership. They diagnose, present, perform all the clinical, etc. Now, one thing I should say is if you're opening multiple locations, I would probably look at, if I'm bringing doctors in, eventually having them have some degree of skin in the game. I think you are setting yourself up very dangerously if you're setting up multiple offices and these doctors don't have skin in the game. And I've seen that happen a lot, where you'll have somebody who opens up a second practice or a third practice and they have somebody working for them and then the person quits. So now they're having to work in that office to keep it going so it doesn't totally close, which then waters down the productivity of their primary office and they're in a bit of a mess. Ideally, you want to bring somebody in that eventually could develop into a partner. And again, I'll say this now, I mentioned I wasn't going to get into this stuff, but it's hard to avoid it. If you're bringing somebody in that with potential partnership, I would knock all of that out in the beginning from day one. I'm not saying I would make them a partner day one because you might work with them and it works out terribly. But I would have all of my agreements set up as well as any benchmarks that I expected them to hit knocked out before we started working together. So let's say you've done the interview process. I know I'm going off here, but I should say this. You've done the interview process, you like this person, you get along with this person, you have a good rapport, and their long-term goal is to be a practice owner as well. You think maybe this is somebody I could work with? Okay. Well, then I would work out 3 different agreements or one agreement that encapsulates 2 or 3 different things. One, it's an associate agreement, what they agree to do, what you agree to do. The second portion of the agreement is a buy-in agreement, meaning that once they've hit certain benchmarks, they have the opportunity to buy in. And if this is a practice you're looking at eventually exiting, you could have a buyout agreement in there too. Not as critical, but you should have a provision in any of your corporate paperwork if one of the partners wants to leave, obviously. Otherwise, that can become a real mess. So what they would have to do in order to qualify for partnership is clearly laid out from day one. Doesn't mean they're going to get it. Might be you have to work together 6 months and certain things they have to certain production goals or targets, etc., before you're going to give them partnership, but that should be spelled out early on. Otherwise, and I've seen this happen so many times, you'll have someone working with somebody and the associate thinks that the conditions have been met, but the owner doctor doesn't because they're very nebulous and arbitrary. And then you end up with upsets, which were completely avoidable had you spelled this out from the beginning. So word to the wise, figure this stuff out before you start working together, because then let's say they come to work for you and after a month you go, this just isn't going to work. Well, then they haven't met those benchmarks. Maybe they had a certain production target they had to be at, a longevity target, whatever those things might be. All right, so back to this model number 3, the autonomous model. You have a second location and you have an associate doctor in this location. So for this scenario, overhead control requires even more oversight than usual. There's also a lot of different variables. How you paid for this practice, in other words, how much debt is on it, where is the practice located, how big is it, how many chairs, what do the staff cost, if you've just dropped $500,000 into it or another $150,000 to update the equipment. You have to take these costs into consideration before you settle on a compensation package. So giving the person a flat X percentage doesn't really cut it in every one of these scenarios. The things you want to consider, and you may want to consider this before you buy this practice or start this practice, is one, you want to conservatively estimate the projected practice revenues. Then you want to run these revenues against projected costs, use these figures to work out what you could realistically pay an associate while maintaining a degree of profitability. So if we take a look, you're about to buy this office and you factored in what your debt's going to be, then you conservatively estimate the revenues. Let's say it's an office maybe 30 minutes away and you think it's a good buy, retiring doctor. So you would first look at, okay, this is what it's costing this doctor now. With my debt, it's going to cost me this much. How much conservatively do I think this place will do if I put an associate in here? This is where you don't want to be too wild. Let's say it's doing $35,000 a month and you go, well, I looked through the charts. There's definitely, we could be doing this, this, and that. I could say 40 is real. All right. Well, take that and project it up against what the costs are going to be, what it was costing to run this office, as well as the debt that you're going to be carrying on this office. Okay. In other words, we don't want to do this compensation plan just based on, well, if it all works out great, it'll be fine. Using these figures, we can take a look at how much could I pay a doctor and still maintain a degree of profitability. And personal expectations, even if you're carrying debt with that associate in there, I would expect to be making some profit, even with a conservative estimate. That also tells you if you can't figure out how to make this office profitable with a conservative estimate, I wouldn't buy it. Because otherwise, why? It's like buying real estate at that point. It's a bad investment. Now, as far as how you normally set up the compensation in this case for the autonomous doctor, usually it's a guaranteed base with a percentage override, meaning a percentage kicks in once they've hit certain collection targets. All right, so let me give you an example here. Let's say you've done what we just talked about a minute ago. You've conservatively estimated the revenues of this practice you're looking at purchasing, and you estimate that this place could do $40,000 a month. You're being very conservative. And you figure that you could pay an associate the going rate in your area. Let's say the going rate per diem in your area is $500 a day. Now, it might be more, it might be less, depending on where you practice. But let's just say, to keep the numbers round, let's say it's $500 a day. So the office conservatively could do $40,000 a month, and you could pay this associate $500 a day and still pay your salaries, service your debt, and make a little bit of profit. Well, the office is going to be open an average of 16 days a month, so this is $8,000 a month compensation for this associate. All right. So how do we work out an incentive plan? Because obviously we want some type of an incentive for this doctor so that the place does more than $40,000 a month, or at least that this doctor sees rewards for it doing more than $40,000 a month. All right, then what we're going to do now is we're going to go back for a second to that traditional associate model, that 30% number that we were using back in the traditional model, and we're going to blend it with this salary. So let's look at how that might look. You would do $8,000 a month guaranteed for 16 days a month, and you're going to pay them 30% of everything over $40,000 to $45,000. So, in other words, you're paying them you're estimating $40,000. That's what you think you could conservatively do, and you can afford paying $8,000 when you do that, $40,000 to $45,000. And you can afford to pay $8,000. Well, then you're going to pay them 30% of everything over that 40 to 45% number and split the lab fees with them. Percentage-wise, it's not amazing, but it has an upside. The doctor has more autonomy, and some of these situations could lead to a potential partnership, as I was talking about earlier. And obviously, a lot of this depends on your baseline. But if I were to establish a maximum collection percentage, I would say it's 30, or a maximum percentage of compensation in this scenario for somebody, it would be 30%. However it's paid out. The problem is, in this little scenario I gave you, you couldn't pay them 30% of $40,000 because the numbers wouldn't work. So here you're guaranteeing them $8,000 a month, and it's 30% of everything over $40,000 or $45,000. And again, this is a scenario where I'd be looking at a potential buy-in if you're going to have somebody in a location that you're not getting to a lot. So those are the three basic models: traditional, production doctor, and autonomous. Now, let's talk about the pay plans a bit and how there may be a blend of a guaranteed base and things of that nature. And there's a term that I want to introduce to you here. This term is what I call the viability level. Viable means, capable of sustaining life, right? So viability level. So I want you to imagine for a second, if you are guaranteeing somebody, let's say you're guaranteeing a base, and let me turn my calculator on here so that I'm not completely off the rails. If you're guaranteeing somebody a base of, I don't know, $10,000 a month, let's say, $10,000 a month. That's the base you're guaranteeing this new associate, or $120,000 a year. All right, and let's say you're bringing them in on a traditional associate model. $10,000 a month, traditional associate model, which, if you remember, and I've done a lot of talking, is 30 to 35% of collections. Let's just use 30 as a number here for simplicity's sake. So you're offering them $10,000 a month. Well, the first thing I would want to estimate is, with this base, what is $10,000 a month 30% of? Well, it's 30% of $33,333, 333, right? $33,333. In other words, that $10,000 you're giving them is 30% of $33,333. Now, we don't want to exceed 30, right? So I would not have any type of an incentive beyond until that associate hits 33,333. They don't get anything else until they hit that number. And then beyond that, there's a couple of other, that's their viability level, because that also works in reverse. Let's say you're paying them $10,000 a month and they're doing $20,000 to $25,000 a month. Well, that doesn't work. You're actually at that point paying them 40, almost 50%. That viability level, in other words, is what number they have to be at where their salary doesn't exceed the percentage that it should be. Do you see? So in other words, if the level I'm paying this associate is at 20%, that's their it's a production doctor model, right? At 20%, if I'm paying them $10,000, they cannot produce less than $50,000, 1/5. If they're producing 40, I'm losing. I'm going unprofitable at that point. That's their viability level. So it's important to set that viability level or viability point early on when you're constructing your plan, and also to know it, because then you see, is it really working or is it not working with this associate? Now, I've seen doctors do something which I consider to be not smart from a business perspective, which is, let's say this associate, you're paying $10,000 a month, and you've got the traditional model, let's say, which is that 30% number, and they're not producing over 33,000. They're producing 20, 25. So you start taking work off of your schedule and giving it to them so that they get busier and increase their productivity, because you feel bad seeing your associate doing nothing. And what are you doing in the meantime? You're, browsing the internet or reading a magazine. That doesn't work. If your associate is busy and you are not, my question would be, why do you have an associate at that point? Something is terribly wrong with that setup. So that cannot happen. There's another little nuance I would give you here, which maybe, I don't know, might be a little bit too complex for a podcast, but I'm going to throw it out here anyway. The incentive I would give somebody would have a lot to do with what base salary I'm guaranteeing. Let me explain. In other words, if you have to guarantee somebody, let's say the base salary you're guaranteeing is pretty low. Let's say you're guaranteeing a base salary of, $6,000 a month for a full-time associate. That's their guaranteed base. Well, using that viability number again, let's say that you're in the 30% setup, they're autonomous, right? Or they're in the traditional model, rather. Using that 30% number, you're guaranteeing them $6,000. Well, $6,000 is 30% of $20,000. Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to give them, here's your $6,000, and anything that they produce over 20, I'm going to pay them 30% of. You could also pay them less. You could work out some type of an incentive. But I look at it in this case, this person is asking for a low base salary. They're willing to be there. That's a very low base salary to be paying an associate doctor. So they are taking on some of the risk themselves. They're not transferring it all to me. So their incentive plan is going to start right there when they hit their viability point. Do you see? They hit that 20, boom. They get their we call it override, in other words, that percentage they get once they hit 20. Now let's take the reverse. Let's say I have that same traditional associate model, and this associate is asking for a guaranteed base of $12,000 a month or $144,000 a year. All right. Well, in that case, they're taking very little risk. I'm taking all the risk at this point. So again, $12,000 a month is 30% of $40,000. All right. Well, I'm going to pay them. If I were using the math I was using with that $6,000 a month associate, I would start paying them an override at 40. Well, in this case, I'm taking on more risk. So I'm probably not going to set their 30% override up until they hit 50 because I've taken on more risk. So they're getting $12,000 guaranteed, and anything they produce over 50, they can have 30% of. Whereas the person I'm guaranteeing $6,000, anything they hit over 20, which is that right there, that viability point of $20,000, which is exactly 30% of 6,000 or 6,000 30% of, they start getting paid because we're sharing the risk. Whereas the $12,000 a month associate, I'm taking it all myself. That's my personal opinion. I think that works out a little better. And then that can, in certain cases, make up for if they have a bit of a hiccup month where they don't hit that 50. But again, there's a little bit of pressure because if they're getting paid $12,000, you need to be doing $50,000. They're not doing it. That happens for a month, 2 months, 3 months. Then, well, now you have problems. So these are a couple things to think with as far as when you're constructing this, just that viability point. It may not transfer real well discussing it on a podcast, but I wanted to throw it out there. All right, so I hope you are still awake, especially if you are driving after all of those numbers. It was quite a bit to talk about. I kind of went on about it. We do have a blog post about this on the MGE blog that you can read where I actually have some of the numbers. We're also going to have all of these numbers available on the webpage for the podcast, so you can kind of go through it and see how this all lays out. I'll have the article available for you there. But I hope this helps. And a couple last things I consider when you're doing this. Once you've figured out that you need an associate, right? You should start thinking with this now, but if you figure out that you need an associate, I would have this pay plan completely knocked out before you bring them in and make sure, run it against your numbers to make sure that it actually works. And I would definitely have an attorney that I was working with to make sure that I had my associate contract in place and so that there are no surprises after I bring them in and they've been working there for a bit. And bringing on another provider can be exciting. It's a sign of expansion. So you want to keep it fun and make it as fun as possible long term. And as I mentioned earlier, especially when you get into some of these models, which were a bit more complex, you got to know exactly what you're doing. This is where training and education comes in handy. This is where we're here to help. If you want a practice consultation to discuss this a bit, to see how this would work, you can give us a call here at MGE at 800-640-1140 or visit us online at mgeonline.com. Guys, I hope this helped, and we'll see you at the next episode.